Should we support 4-day work weeks? Is owning an AR-15 more fundamental to liberty than voting? And can libertarians and anarchists make moral judgments? We'll answer these questions and more on today's episode of Good Take, Bad Take. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of the Good Take, Bad Take podcast. This is the podcast where we gather takes from across the internet, ones that we find interesting, and we pick apart whether we think they are good or bad. My name is Britt, and I'm here with my co-host Donnie. And before we get started, make sure to like, share, subscribe. You can find us on Instagram at Good Take, Bad Take Pod, and Twitter and YouTube at Good Bad Take Pod. And without further ado, let's get into some of these takes. So the first take that we've got is from Nina Turner, and she tweets or posts, "Do you support a 4-day, 32-hour work week with the same pay?" And then she replies to it with the a UAW seeks 4-day work week graph that shows happiness rising when they do this. What do you think, Donnie? Is this a good idea?
It's such a blanket statement that I can't say it on, en masse is probably not as a, general overall policy, but it might be in some specific context.
Yeah.
The great thing about the free market capitalist system is that jobs that this would benefit can move to that pattern.
Yes.
And it might be slower on the uptick for some, and that's unfortunate, but then the businesses that do offer it and can do it with good results will then offer it and take away the best workers who want to do that and make other employers move in that direction. It's kind of like with remote work. I mean, I think that you're seeing an overwhelming amount of businesses try to remove remote work options specifically because of the tie-in from governments that are, removing tax break status or things like they're putting pressure on these big businesses to remove remote work. But really what we saw in spite of all that is that a lot of places decided that, remote work is feasible, it is good, and it does provide a benefit. Now, not every job can do that. Not every job should have those requirements involved. But again, just like a 4-day, 32-hour work week, it can work great for some places and not so great for others. So to start insisting that this needs to be a universal model, I think would be ridiculous and silly. And it's just that ever-encroaching claim of what is or isn't a right. Do workers have a right to a 4-day work week, a right to 32 hours work with the same pay? I don't think that anyone has a right to that kind of thing anyway, but it might boost morale enough to make the productivity offsets much higher than the lost hours worked.
Yeah, this take is funny, and like you're saying, it's neither good nor bad until you start inferring why she wants this 32-hour work week with the same pay.
Yeah,
like an example of this is I was doing a framing job in a basement, and normally when you're framing, you've got to get like a plumb line so that you make sure that your base plate and your top plate are all lined up and everything's good. And you're like trying to hold it and try and move things. So it's usually best done when there's two people working on that type of project. But I was like, man, I want to be able to have my brother do other stuff while I'm doing this. So I spent $120 on a laser level and plumb. And I was now able to do, the work of two people by myself. So, essentially what she's talking about, it's a different ratio, but I was able to do the same amount of work, same amount of output for less amount of man hours. And I have no problem with, supporting a 4-day, 32-hour work week with the same pay. You have to extend that, though, as it's a 4-day, 32-hour work week with the same or greater output for the same amount of pay. That's awesome. But these people don't have that in mind. They only think unilaterally on the aspect of, well, this would make employees and workers happier, so let's do that. And that's the only reason that you should ever do anything and implement anything for these people like Nina Turner that support things like, we should support a $50 an hour minimum wage and things like that. But like you were saying, this can be a good decision in some instances, but it has to bear the same amount of consequences and operate within reality. If there's an aspect of it that's being subsidized by the government, if there's some sort of regulation that makes it difficult for any competitor to get in, so companies can use this to like keep people away from other competitors and things like that, then it's not real. And if you're operating in reality and you can do a 4-day, 32-hour work week with the same or greater pay, I mean, that's awesome. But what that means, if you can operate that sustainably, is that you have made technological or efficiency processes that make it possible for that to happen in a sustained way, across all time. If you look at, and what the good news is, this is the arc of human history in terms of when innovation and free markets are allowed to flourish. the same amount of someone that was able to produce X amount of food, 500 years ago, is now able to produce, an exponentially more amount of food today with less work and hypothetically less hours worked. And that's just the benefit of, the amount of technological process that's occurred, and people have gains in efficiency and things like that. But without that aspect, without that input, you can't actually have a 4-day, 32-hour work week with the same pay indefinitely. It will eventually run out.
Exactly where I was going to go next, which is that the only reason why it's even remotely feasible is because of the advances that we have, not because society is all of a sudden becoming aware that 32 hours is a human right or something. Oh, we just were too in our dark ages, but in the past it's like, no, in the past we literally had to work that amount of hours in order to sustain ourselves. And so if we're moving in that trajectory, that's good. But referencing the sort of the happiness going up with US workers, it also needs to come at perspective. It's very similar to an argument that was made. It's been made by a lot of leftists, but I specifically remember it being shared by Debbie Wasserman Schultz, the former DNC chairwoman, the one who was very influential in rigging the election for Hillary Clinton. And she's a representative from Florida, I believe. And she made this argument about raising the minimum wage and talked about how, look, economic wage theory shows that when you pay your workers more, you get more productivity from them. And it's like, yeah, but that comes in the reality in which they live. It's not a matter of handing someone more dollars and all of a sudden they're more productive and therefore you raise the minimum wage for everyone. The reality is, when you get paid more, it's relative to what you were making and relative to what other jobs in your field are making and what relative to what your coworkers are making, etc. And so, yeah, you're working harder because you realize this job is now more valuable to me. If you're raising the minimum wage across the board, that job doesn't have the comparative value increase that you think it does because everything has just become that much more expensive. Or at the very least, every job in that field has just become equally as valuable. Your raise that isn't an individual sign of value that particular job should make you more productive if every other job like it is also getting that raise. So that is the exact same thing happening here with the 32-hour 4-day work week. This is the reason why it's increasing happiness is because it is in direct relation to the 40-hour 5-day work week that we work now. And that's not to say that, again, it's not to say that I think that it's an inaccurate metric and that people can be happier when they have more free time. But you also have to recognize that the productivity gains, the happiness gains are going to necessarily spike when you're giving them something that is directly better than what they are currently used to, whether or not that is actually going to translate into long-term same level or net output of more happiness or long-term net output of more productivity is an entirely different matter. And you need to make sure that you're factoring that in, because again, a 32-hour 4-day work week is abnormal. And so even if you're not comparing it directly to what you had, you're comparing it to, every other job out there, which 90% of them are operating under that same 40-hour 5-day work week. So this is a unique benefit. If we move to that unilaterally, like, Nina Turner probably will say is a human right, next week, then you're removing that comparative gain and advantage. Again, there might be some net positive outputs from it in terms of human happiness, being able to spend more time with family and things like that, which I do think are good things. But if you're not offsetting that with actual productivity, then you have to come up with that value somewhere if you're keeping the same pay.
Yeah. Yep. All right, moving on to our next one. We've got Phil Labonte quote retweeting or quote posting another user. And this user writes originally, owning an AR-15 is more. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, he's got a typo in there.
Yeah, he's got a typo. Anyways, Phil Labonte's is basically summarizing it. Owning an AR-15 is a more important and fundamental aspect of liberty than voting. What do you think?
I think that's completely true. It's a good take because people say, well, if without voting, how are you going to keep your leaders accountable? And it's kind of a chicken and egg situation, except that a bullet has a little bit more reality than writing something on a piece of paper does, in the sense that, okay, but without the AR-15, who's going to be there to respect your vote to begin with, assuming that voting even has any power, right?
Yeah.
An AR-15, any kind of arm, any ability to arm yourself, that is the right to self-defense is the right to look
Yes.
out for yourself, to keep your own life in check and take matters into your own hands, not rely on others. So while in an sort of idyllic government situation, which sounds a little oxymoronic, I know, your right to voting is honored, it is upheld, and it is an important right to liberty. But at the end of the day, even in that idyllic situation, it's still, one, reliant on others to vote for you, and two, reliant on the people who are elected to keep preserving those rights. So everything about voting is at least two steps removed from liberty and your own individualized freedom and your own life than self-defense is. Self-defense is the most immediate form of ways you can take charge of your own life and protect yourself. Voting protects yourself in a very roundabout way in an ideal situation, which isn't always the case anyway.
Yeah, I always have found it funny, like this belief that liberty and letting, people who don't live your same lifestyle, don't have any of the same religious or ideological beliefs as you, having the same amount of say in your life as you and do in theirs, and sometimes more in their case, because there's sometimes more of them, is compatible with this concept of liberty, because it's just not. I mean, so that's kind of like an interesting, like, weird perspective that people have. Like, I guess I wouldn't really draw that like liberty and voting are one and the same, or like even part of each other. In a lot of ways, I feel like democracy and voting is actually the enemy of liberty. And so that makes me agree even more with Phil's post in that, in AR-15, if we broaden it out, right? Like, because a lot of people will say like, well, when the Constitution was written and the Declaration of Independence was written, like the thing that they had was, a musket that took hours to reload and things like that. It's not limited. It's not talking about the specific technological advancement. It's talking about defense in general, the ability to arm yourself with whatever is the current technological best way to defend yourself today, and execute that. Because defense is, and as best as we can live at peace with people around us, everyone wants to do that in general. Because when there's destruction of property, everyone is worse off. But you still have to have that level of like, okay, if I go and do something that my neighbor doesn't like, and I continuously do that, and I'm victimizing them and I'm taking things from them, the knowledge that there could be a potential retaliation is important. And we recognize this, even if we don't recognize it at the individual level. If you scale it up to like the country level, like we recognize that like, oh yeah, like all countries operate within some sort of anarchistic relationship to each other, and that no one has like people say like there's the United Nations and things as the over governing body, but like every country has some form of defense, and we still figure out how to trade with each other. No one is trying to aggress upon each other, because we know that it's bad for business and bad for growth and all those things. So the ability to defend yourself is a fundamental aspect of liberty. I think voting is not as much. In a lot of ways, it's a very anti-liberty stance. You and I, us poor souls that live in this social hellscape of Washington State. Most of the people that are around us do not agree with the same things that we agree with, and not only do they disagree with us, but they are very, very motivated to push their types of agendas and beliefs and lifestyles upon us. And obviously, like I was saying, like you and I are the minority here in from an ideological standpoint. So the voting, it does not really equate to more liberty for you and I. It only equates to tyranny.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I mean, at its, this isn't the most compelling argument, but it is at least something to consider, that when setting up a government, there's sort of an implicit need to outline how it works, right? Like, in order to set up a government, you have to say what the government will or will not do. So that's just kind of necessary. But it is something to note that the government doesn't have to guarantee something like gun rights. And yet the fact that that is specifically outlined, and it's the second of the amendments, that was decided to be created, it is really noteworthy, right? That, you're going to have your voting rights in there, but that's because like, just kind of like, because you kind of have to. That's just how the government operates. The right to arms was critical, and the founders knew that. So that at the very least, at the very, very least, even if your perspective is, well, I still think voting rights are more important, you have to at least recognize that there is a very, very close relationship to liberty and arming yourselves.
Sure.
Because it's not just this, oh, people are obsessed with their guns because they want to kill things. Like that's not part of it. Even if you're convinced that somehow voting is more important, you have to at least recognize that owning a weapon was important enough to outline as the Second Amendment for the founders. So they at least saw that it was pretty imperative to maintaining liberty and keeping tyrants at bay at the very least. And again, that's not the strongest argument, but even if you're not convinced by all this, I think you have to at least recognize it's not a complete far cry that guns and liberty are linked, at least in some cases.
Yes. All right, moving on to our next one. We've got a quote repost from Matt Walsh, who's commenting on a video. And maybe some of you have seen this video. It's a young woman. She's 29. And she basically has this video about like, hey, like I'm not married. I don't have kids. And it's actually awesome because I can go to a Beyonce concert till 1 a.m., get hammered, wake up at 10, and then do whatever I want with the rest of my day. And Matt Walsh commented on this saying, her life doesn't revolve around her family and kids. So instead it revolves around TV shows and pop stars. Worst of all, she's too stupid to realize how depressing this is. And then a Twitter user replied, there's nothing wrong with what this woman said. Is her going to a concert or watching TV that different from single dudes who watch sports? The comments are full of equally insane people with equally insane takes. Value is subjective. What do you think? On the quote repost.
Yeah, right. It's one of those things where it's kind of like, yeah, value is subjective, but you also have to kind of see that a life that is focused on things that are not lasting and ephemeral, it's kind of like what I would view as almost the natural law written in our hearts, where yes, value is subjective, and sure, people are entitled to live in certain ways, but also recognizing the fact that like things that last have a unique kind of value that things that are distant, departed, and interact with you in no meaningful way don't. This is kind of the Ayn Randian form of why, even though she is an atheist, views life as valuable, is because life is unique. You cannot create life. Life is not something that just comes from nothing. Because it is a finite thing and it is completely unique, it has value. And that's kind of her justification for these things. And I think that even though value is subjective, you have to recognize that living your life in such a way as to, again, go to concerts every day and all that is going to run out, and you're going to feel that deep in your soul. And so, you know, I think kudos to you if that's how you live your life, but I don't think that you truly are happy. And that I think that in a holistic sense, that is less valuable than someone who is raising a family, who is creating new life. Again, that unique value, which I would view as, you know, God breathed and inherently sacred. There's nothing that can compare to that. Or even, you know, fostering relationships with your immediate family, even if you don't have kids, even if you're not able to do that in that kind of way. Putting value in things like, you know, these sort of short-term gains, I do think has, again, people can value things differently, but I think it is a uniquely different value that does not have any of the long-term permanence of joy and lasting ramifications that a more traditional value system would offer.
One of the things I find interesting about this whole scenario is people like will choose to like freeze like a time period in their life where they think like, oh, this is the perfect blend of I have no responsibilities, but I have the freedom to go do whatever I want. And it's usually somewhere between, it used to be like somewhere between like 18 and 23. And somehow it has creeped all the way up to like 30 and 35. And it's basically like because of like, oh, well, when it's acceptable to be childless or not married. And it used to be, you know, a lot earlier. Now it's growing later. But like this type of argumentation, like, oh, value is subjective. Like you, from our like Misesian economic human action standpoint, like that's true. Like value is subjective. That action plays out differently based on how people perceive the value of certain actions and certain types of commodities and goods and lifestyles and things like that. But it is not a moral, like, it is not a moral statement or a way to like evaluate people's choices from a moral standpoint. Like you were saying, based on like the level of meaningfulness and things like that. And if you would talk to someone and say, hey, like you have no responsibilities, but you are 6 years old, like I don't think anyone would think that's actually awesome. The fact of the matter is that as you get older and the more responsibility you have and the more you take upon yourself, the more suffering you might have, the more energy you might have to expel, and the more things you might have to do that you don't necessarily want, but the reward is there, and the meaning, and it's in the form of meaningfulness and having purpose in your life. And it's not to say, I mean, we've talked about this before, like you and I would both agree that, like, in general, people, the most meaningful and important thing someone can do is to get married and to have a family. That's not to say that everyone should do that, and that's how it, it's 100% ironclad rule or anything like that. But in general, that is because of all of human history, and we keep doing it and keep doing it. It is one of the most meaningful things that you can do. Speaking for myself, I remember when I was 20, 22, 21, and I was on a trip actually with my now wife. We weren't dating. We weren't even interested in each other or anything like that. But I was very much like, oh, I want to go get this and do awesome things, and I remember asking her, we were on a trip in Europe for our business school. I said, hey, well, what do you want to do once you graduate, or like kind of what's your dream job? And I remember her saying, she's like, well, I want to do cool business things and all that. But at the end of the day, like, I really want to just become a mom. And I remember thinking at that time that, like, oh man, like, that's kind of sad, like, why would you ever just want to do that? Don't you have bigger goals? Because I thought, oh, my big goals and my dreams are like the biggest thing you could ever do. And ironically, right, we end up getting married. We're having a kid here in the next 3 weeks. And it's the most, of all the things that I've had an opportunity and pleasure and blessing to do, like getting married to her and having a kid is the most meaningful, purposeful, and awesome thing I know I'll ever do in my life. And I didn't understand at that time that taking on responsibility could result in, taking on responsibility, not just for my own future, but for the future of others, could result in so much happiness and joy. Because you want things that last beyond. If you're only living for yourself, it's not going to be a meaningful life. It is not a good life. And just because value is subjective on the economic front doesn't mean we can't make a moral statement about it, from our ideological standpoint. And what's unfortunate is this poor woman is going to, in 10 years, she is going to have the same size and scope of world as a 6-year-old, and that people will have to take care of her. Or she's just going to end up, incredibly unhappy.
Yeah, I think that is important. The distinction between, value in a moral framework and in an economic framework is important. And I think it's also important to recognize, you can look at both and acknowledge both exist from both angles, right? To say that, oh, value is subjective purely in an economic front, therefore you have no say to weigh in on this on a moral front is to bury your head in the sand a little bit and to say, oh, nope, value is subjective in this sphere, therefore it has no relation to the moral one. When in reality, value can have different reference points. Value from an economic subjective front, value from a moral front, value from a relational front. There's all kinds of ways to hold values of things, and to completely ignore one, and at least deny someone being able to even weigh in on that, I think is being purposely oblivious, maybe.
Yeah. All right, moving on to our next one. We've got Hassan and then someone kind of replying to it, and we're just going to evaluate this as a whole. So recently, a new video game called Starfield was released. There was a British video game review guy. I don't really know what he does. Anyways, he got pretty grumpy that Starfield had a bunch of pronoun stuff in it, like you had to select your pronouns to create a character and things like that. And so he made a video where he kind of exploded about it. And Hassan replied, or quote retweeted it and said, "This weird British guy losing his mind over selecting pronouns in Starfield is the perfect demonstration for why we must bring back lobotomies. Bro should be mad that the menu, maps, UI is confusing, the game is not optimized well for PCs, and that the main quest is kind of dull in comparison to the side adventures. But he's mad about pronouns. He had to choose, like in every single game where there's a character creator." And then someone else followed up on this, like, how are pronouns political? What do you think about this overall exchange?
Yeah. So, and to clarify, the pronouns political was in response to a different guy, Dr. Disrespect, talking about things like, oh, don't bring politics into video games, which I actually think is a dumb take because a lot of video games are political. Yes. But yeah, this is all part of the thing. Now, the thing that there's so many things that I just hate about what's going on here. First and foremost, the lowest hanging fruit, the clickbait almost of this is Hassan saying bro's mad he has to about pronouns he had to choose like in every single game where there's a character creator. No, that's not true. In fact, I saw someone who was making a joke about Pokemon Professor Oak and replied with Professor Woke because he asks, "Are you a boy or a girl or whatever?" He wasn't even trying to make a commentary. He was just being kind of goofy. But that in a sense kind of highlights what was going on, which is that when we had character creators or when you made a profile on a game, it asked, "Are you a boy or are you a girl?" Essentially, those were the choices. And now putting in pronouns is a distinctly different thing than just choosing each gender, because you are divorcing the reality of what a pronoun stands for and what your sex is. Excuse me. And when you ignore that is a departure, then of course you're going to have this weird reductionist, oh, why are you so mad about pronouns kind of a thing. But the other thing is that pronouns are never just pronouns. It's always indicative of something deeper. There's always it's kind of the surface level feeling of frustration for things that are underneath the core, right? By denying the reality of, saying that if you are a male, you're going to have he pronouns, you are fundamentally taking a side in this sort of cultural discussion that's happening. And that's, my issue with this, second take of how are pronouns political? Well, quite easily they're political, because if at best your point is that, oh, someone's identity shouldn't be political because it's just who they are, okay, that might be one aspect, but to completely ignore the fact that this is clearly a major cultural and political discussion right now, and the idea that you are requiring people to implicitly acknowledge that there can be a difference between male and your he him pronouns or whatever, however you want to do that is to take a side essentially. And it's it'd be like every time you made a male character in a game, if it had check this box or uncheck this box if you're not a murderer, it's like, well, like why are you implicitly implying that all men are going to be murderers unless it's like, hey, you just uncheck it, bro, it's not a big deal. It's like clearly doing that is making a statement of some kind. It's not just this sort of neutral thing that exists. And so it's very frustrating to see people sort of play this dumb game like, how are pronouns political? Because again, if I were to have like a game and just say something about like, we believe that you shouldn't kill unborn life, and then them say, wow, I can't believe you're making that political. It's like, how is protecting life political? You just shouldn't kill people. That shouldn't be political. It's like, clearly that would be a political thing. I can recognize that it shouldn't be political to not want to kill unborn babies. I should recognize that it shouldn't be political. I can recognize that it shouldn't be political to have, value life in this very non-political way. But also I can recognize, because I'm not a complete idiot, that our culture is one that holds that in a political discussion, and there are political implications of that. So all of this to say that, yeah, if there's just a pronoun, selector on the menu, that in and of itself isn't the most horrible, awful, offensive thing. It's what it stands for. It's how it's making you essentially tacitly admit something that is contrary to reality, and in particular in a very hot button issue politically today.
Yeah, the reason this guy reacted so poorly, and maybe not specifically him, but I know the reason a lot of people that I know that enjoy video games and things like that react poorly to this type of stuff is because it feels like an encroachment upon like a space that should not have this type of preachiness into it. I think they would be equally as disturbed if there was some sort of, whatever equivalent Christian symbol, or like, oh, are you, select whether you are a Catholic or a Protestant or a Baptist or whatever. It's like, well, I don't know. It's just kind of weird. Why are you putting that in there? And what it does is it signals that, like, hey, this game that you've been looking forward to, this universe that you are about to step into, that you are going to encounter a story and go through it and see all the implications of it. This checkbox means that we're going to preach to you about this type of thing in it.
Yep.
This is inherent to the story and to your character. And like, that's like, man, like, why do we want that? This was the one place that maybe I could like avoid that type of stuff and just enjoy a story. But unfortunately, we've seen this like also in movies as well. and the movies that have them like kind of get universally disrespected because they're propaganda. They're not actually story. And I have this actual issue with a lot of like contemporary Christian music, just coming from a music background, is that it's not actual art. It's just propaganda. It's I started with a point that I wanted to make, and I tried to infuse emotion into that point instead of starting with like, hey, there's a reality or story I would like to tell, and I'm going to set up these characters. I'm going to set up these scenarios in such a way that the truth rings out and they actually play themselves out the way that they would in real life. That's one of the beautiful things about any great literature like Solzhenitsyn, these guys that will write things that it's like, wow, these characters almost feel real to me. And this checkbox now necessitates that like, hey, this pronoun thing is going to be a real part of the character that you are. And because a lot of people don't resonate with that, it feels like an encroachment, and it's unfortunate. It seems like there's no spaces left for because video games are primarily a men thing, male deal. There's not a lot of spaces left where that is, and they feel the necessity to invade those spaces, and that's why you're having this reaction from people, specifically from males. It's also why you're having the reaction from males, like within sports and things like that as well. So yeah, it's always funny to me as well when people say things like, "How are pronouns political?" It's like, well, it's basically, if you divide the line. Like say that like okay, here's a room of 100 people, if divided by who believes that pronouns, if there are a bunch of pronouns other than he and she, and they don't correspond to biological sex, the line down the middle would result in literally Democrats and Republicans on each side of it, right? Like you could predict with basically 99.9% certainty what type of political affiliation someone is based on which side of the line they stand on. So that alone, regardless of whether or not, from like a philosophical standpoint, our pronouns political, from just a reality standpoint, it is.
That's exactly right. Well, and with the escapism too, I in sort of the thread that was above the how are pronouns political, someone saying, oh, we should keep these sort of politics out of games and things like that. It's like, well, on the whole, I understand sort of thinking that is kind of dumb, and that there are a lot of political games, but it's also like there are different games of different genres, just like there are different movies of different mediums, different books of different genres, and all of these things have a time and place for certain discussions and things. If I'm reading, I don't know, like a detective novel that's sort of lighthearted and comical, I'm not going to want the gravity of, like, I don't know, like the religious iconoclasm of Endo's silence in there, talking about like torture and stepping on religious symbolism. That might not be the best mix and things like that. Like I wanted to read this book because I kind of wanted to read like a lighthearted comedy on this kind of like very depressing, gripping reality check of the spiritual and the symbolic is maybe not the best place for that. And so even from that perspective, it's like, we recognize that games can be political, but when you're playing Starfield, you're not expecting to have to deal with, again, this very hot button cultural issue being shoved in your face. Yeah. And so to me, it's just one of those things where it's all very one-sided. And if the exact same thing happened where like one of the characters just passively expressed that they were pro-life and it wasn't even a main thing to the quest and there wasn't anything else to do with it, do you know how outraged the left would be about this?
Yeah.
They would say, oh, I can't believe you're shoving these messages down our throat. But that's what people who are anything to the right of like Stalin are dealing with these days, from the left in game media and things like that. Yeah. So that's why pronouns are political, because it's just this ever march forward, ever creeping in to every kind of aspect of every game, regardless of genre. If this was something that we're dealing with in a game that's more political in nature or more serious in nature in that kind of way, I could get it. Like even something, I don't like the game particularly, but something like Detroit Become Human, even in that sense, like these kinds of questions feel a little bit more appropriate. Sure. Because it's actually part of the storyline in the medium. For sort of an action adventure RPG like Starfield, it just feels, again, more preachy than beneficial in any kind of capacity.
Yeah. All right, moving on to our last one. We've got R.M. McIntyre commenting on a tweet by Reverend Dr. Jackie Lewis, who writes, "Parents do not own their children. Kids are people, not things. They have a right to privacy about their sexuality and gender identity, to choose when and to whom they share those intimate details about their life. And Aaron replies, no child is autonomous. They will always be under the protection and authority of someone. When someone says that parents don't own their children, that's because they want to own those children instead. These people want to remove children from the protection of their parent in order to shape their understanding of sexual norms. What do you think?
I think Aaron's take is absolutely correct and right, and the continued march towards this that you're seeing from all kinds of people, because this is not the only take that I've seen about this recently. Even it is scary to see, because that is not the kind of thing that you want to be hearing about your kids, about other people involving your kids. Like, listen, kids are autonomous, right? Kids are unique individuals, but just like Aaron said, children aren't entirely autonomous. Children aren't fully developed. Each individual is autonomous to a point, but not when you're, to say, a child is entirely on his own would be completely silly and ridiculous. You'd have to recognize that from the moment they're born, they're dependent in different ways and in different measures. And so to not recognize that there is not only a physical dependence from children on their parents, but there is also a spiritual or mental or developmental dependence that children have on from their parents is critical to just dealing with reality. And so I shudder to think about what this kind of person, at the end of the day, like what their kind of best goals or designs or ideas would be for a society going forward, because that is not something that I'm interested in taking part in. And I think Oren is right in that they basically just want to reshape how children experience and think about the world in terms of sexuality, which is really a devious and kind of evil thing to do.
Yeah, I as a UFC fan, there's a fighter named Khabib, and he's a very conservative, Orthodox Muslim, but he had a really fantastic take on, not on this, but this in general, in public school and things like this. He's like, look, like, your kids, when they go to school, they will go there for 8 hours a day, and they're going to be taught by someone that you as a person probably have nothing in common with or don't even agree with. And he's like, some of these people that have these ideas about gender norms and things like that, you wouldn't even want to spend 5 minutes in the same room with them talking about these types of topics, because you just wouldn't have anything in common and wouldn't believe anything they're saying. And he's like, but yet we send our kids to those schools to be in a room with those people for 8 to 9 hours every day. He's like, this is craziness. And I agree with him. And I think that this perspective that Jackie Lewis, or whatever her name is coming out, that like, oh, well, your parents, you don't own your children. They still need to be sent to all these indoctrination camps. I think it is a reaction of necessity for them to stay alive. Essentially, they're not like literally alive, but for their ideologies to continue. Because liberals and leftists that adhere to these types of crazy ideologies, they are not having kids. It's kind of obvious in some ways, both from a selfishness standpoint of like not wanting to have kids, as well as to a practical standpoint of if you chop off your genitals and do things like that, you're not going to have kids. So the only way that they can have kids and can continue to have their ideology stay alive is to have yours, essentially. And Aaron McIntyre is really perceptive, and that's like, yeah, like kids are not autonomous. They will someone will have authority over them. Someone will shape how they think. Kids are sponges. One of the guests that we had from what was that? The John podcast. Which verse was it?
Oh, the John 3:15 podcast.
The John 3:15 podcast. I think it was Jeremy had mentioned that, like, oh yeah, like the kids will be indoctrinated. Like, it's only a matter of like who's going to indoctrinate them and who do you think is best to indoctrinate them. And parents know their kids best because they have them, and most parents are the best people to determine like how their children should be raised because they have a vested interest in it, not only from a practical standpoint, but also from an emotional standpoint. These public school teachers and people that they want to have be the main voice in your kid's life, they have their ideologies and they have a society they want to perpetuate. They do not have your children's future in mind. They might have it in some form or fashion, but it is definitely not the primary reason or the primary objective is your children's well-being. They have some sort of ideology that they want to put onto them. And it's going to happen one way or the other. And so these people will trying to obfuscate it by being like, oh no, like this is some neutral ground that we want to be on, and we just want to raise them neutrally. And parents are not able to do that neutrally. It's like, no, like parents are actually the base level of where a kid should get their identity and where they should get their how they think about the world from, and it should be the default. It's not always the right thing, but basically always it's the proper place for kids to get all that stuff from.
Right. And to recognize, yeah, not all parents are perfect, for sure.
Yeah.
But again, we always have to go down to that idea of centralized authority and power, which is to say, who is to determine that, and who has the right to determine that. It's funny because I think in our culture, a lot of what growing up we've seen, and I think a lot of what maybe boomers and Gen Xers have been shaped by, is this very Disney-esque message of, I need to be my own person. I need to break away from what my parents' sort of projections are for me, and I can do whatever I want. And to some degree, there is truth in this, right? Like there isn't a lot of value to an overbearing parent who's forcing their dreams on their child as a way to see themselves succeed in something that they didn't, right? Or because they have this dream, making their kid, follow in that footsteps against their will. Like, that's not great. I get that. But the people now who are trying to push this agenda on are doing the exact same thing, only they're doing it with other people's children, and they're pushing their own ideological agenda on those kids. They're saying, oh, I need my ideas to live into the future. I need these children to take after my ideas and me in this way. And they push themselves onto their kids. All the meanwhile, they're decrying the idea of, well, you need to let your kid think for himself. You need to let your kid explore their own identity. You can't push your outdated notions, but let me push mine on them. And it's the very reverse image that they, claim to sort of rail against in that sort of Disney-esque way of like, oh, it's so evil when parents make their kids conform to their beliefs and force them. And yeah, some parents do that to an overbearing degree, sure, but every person who's trying to ideologically overwrite children from their parents is doing that to the oomph degree, no matter what.
Yeah.
The other thing is that I think that it's not a surprise that we're seeing these kinds of people make these claims and these assertions after COVID, because I think COVID enabled the petty tyrant that we've talked about, the I'm going to dictate what you do because I have a modicum of power because of, oh, there's stickers on the ground that you have to stand by, or you're not wearing a mask in here. And these kinds of ways where they can exercise control over others. Everyone became a mini Karen, a mini tyrant who's inclined that way, who had no authority before. And I think that now that people got that taste, they're sort of exporting that into other areas of their lives. They're saying, oh, you know what? You're right. We can actually tell parents that they don't own their children, and we can enforce this on their kids, because who's more malleable than kids? No one, because they are those sponges that you mentioned.
Absolutely. I don't have any more on this one unless you do.
Nope. I think we're good.
Awesome. Well, friends, thanks for hanging out with us for this show, and we'll catch you on the next one.